On a patch of grass beside a main road in Buckinghamshire, 6 concrete cows stand in a field. They are half the size of real cows, built from scrap and chicken wire and fiberglass, and they have become the most photographed residents of a city that did not exist within living memory. Because in 1967, all of this was farmland, cow pasture, 3 small towns, and a scatter of villages. Then the British government decided to conjure a city for 250,000 people out of those fields. From nothing. On purpose. This is the story of the most ambitious town Britain ever tried to build. A city summoned out of open country in a single human lifetime, laid out on an American grid, mocked from the day of its birth, and quietly, stubbornly, one of the great planning successes of the modern age. People love to laugh at Milton Keynes, the roundabouts, the concrete cows, the endless identical junctions. What almost nobody remembers is that the men who built it did something far stranger than draw a grid on a map. They built a city around the belief that the future could not be known, and the deeper you go into how they did it, the more you realise that the joke was never quite what everyone thought it was. But before the grid, before the cows, before any of it, there was a problem in London. By the middle of the 20th century, London was full. The war had flattened whole districts. The population was climbing, and millions of people were living in housing that should long ago have been condemned. The government's answer had a name that sounded like something out of science fiction: New Towns. Under the New Towns Act of 1946, Britain began building settlements from scratch to draw people out of the overcrowded capital. Stevenage came first, then a whole first generation followed, going up across the country through the 1950s, absorbing what planners like to call London's overspill. In all, across a single generation, Britain would build more than 30 of these new towns, and between them, they would come to house close to 3 million people. It was one of the largest peacetime building programs in the nation's history, an entire archipelago of places willed into existence by government decree. And Milton Keynes was to be the last of them, and by far the largest, the culmination of everything the planners had learned, and every mistake they were determined never to repeat. By the 1960s, it still was not enough. The government decided a third wave was needed, and this one would be different, bigger, more ambitious than anything attempted before. Planners looked at a stretch of North Buckinghamshire almost exactly halfway between London and Birmingham, roughly equidistant from Oxford, Cambridge and Leicester as well. It sat on the main railway line and beside a new motorway. On paper, it was the perfect place to grow a city. There was only one complication: it was not empty. The land the government marked out was not the blank field of legend. Within its boundary stood 3 established towns: Bletchley, Wolverton and Stony Stratford. Around them lay about 15 villages and hamlets, some of them centuries old, and roughly 40,000 people who already called the place home. There was even a small ancient village called Milton Keynes, a few miles east of where the new centre would rise. The planners took its name for the whole project. Most of the 40,000 people living on that land had no real say in what was about to happen to their fields. For those families, the arrival of the new town felt less like a gift than like an upheaval. Bletchley had already been taking London's overspill for years, but this was something else entirely. Farms that had been worked for generations now sat inside a boundary drawn in Whitehall, their futures decided by a corporation that did not yet own a single building. Old field paths were destined to become dual carriageways. Hedgerows would harden into roundabouts, and the quiet market rhythm of North Buckinghamshire was about to be buried, gently and almost completely, under one of the largest building projects the country had ever attempted. On the 23rd of January 1967, the government formally designated the new town. The area was 34 square miles, about 22,000 acres of Buckinghamshire. The target population was 250,000 people. To build it, an organisation was created with extraordinary powers, the Milton Keynes Development Corporation. It could buy land whether the owners wished to sell or not, and it answered to central government rather than to any local council. Its chairman was Lord Campbell of Escan, a sugar magnate whose years-running plantations in British Guiana had left him deeply suspicious of grand, imposed schemes. Its general manager was a builder's son named Fred Roche. Between them, they had been handed a piece of England and told to make a city on it. The plan they produced, published in 1970, is one of the strangest documents in the history of British planning. At its centre was an architect and Labour peer named Richard Llewellyn Davies, a man with deep connections to America and a real appetite for its ideas. Rather than rely on architects alone, he brought social scientists across the Atlantic to help him imagine what a city should even be. The most important of them was an American urban theorist named Melvin Webber. Webber's argument was quietly radical. For centuries, planners had designed cities as fixed visions. A grand avenue here, a cathedral square there, the whole thing frozen into a single dream of how people ought to live. Webber thought this was a mistake. He believed the future was genuinely unknowable, that the way people would work and travel and gather half a century later simply could not be predicted, and that any city built as a rigid monument to one idea would be obsolete before it was even finished. Weber's influence on the project was so great that he has sometimes been called the father of Milton Keynes, though he never lived there and was born an ocean away. His key idea had an odd and rather beautiful name: community without propinquity. For almost all of human history, community had meant nearness. You knew the people on your street, in your parish, within an easy walk. Weber looked at the motor car, the telephone and the earliest computers and argued that this was quietly ending. In the future, he said, people would belong to communities held together less by physical closeness than by shared interests and by the roads and wires that connected them across great distances. He imagined the city itself dissolving into what he called a non-place urban realm, less a fixed location than a vast switchboard of connections. Decades before the internet existed, he was describing something uncannily close to it. So the men building Milton Keynes made an extraordinary decision. They chose not to design a utopia at all. Instead of a fixed masterpiece, they would build a loose framework, a structure flexible enough to absorb whatever the future turned out to be. Fixed things, the drainage and the water and the main roads would form a skeleton. Everything else would be left free to change and grow. It helped that the man in charge distrusted grand plans by instinct. Lord Campbell had watched imposed schemes curdle overseas, and he had little appetite for freezing anyone's life into concrete. Humility here was more than a borrowed theory. It was a temperament. That skeleton was the grid. Unique in Britain, the plan laid the top level of roads out on a grid of squares, each one about 1 kilometre across, the main routes running horizontal and vertical across the whole site. It was built for the KAR, deliberately, at a time when barely half the households in Britain owned one at all. The planners were betting the entire city on a future of mass car ownership that had not yet arrived. Low, green, spread out, generous with space. The whole layout borrowed openly from an American essay with a telling title, "A City is Not a Tree," which argued that a living city should be a tangled web of overlapping connections and never a neat branching hierarchy. When the plan was published, the newspapers knew exactly what it reminded them of. The Times ran an editorial in March 1970 under a headline that stuck to the place for the next 50 years. Los Angeles, in brackets, Buckinghamshire. To its makers, it was never meant as an insult. Freedom of choice, opportunity, easy movement. Those were the founding goals, written into the plan itself. A city where nobody's chances in life would be narrowed by where they happen to live, or by simply not being able to get somewhere. And that is the paradox at the very heart of Milton Keynes. The place that looks, to this day, like the most rigidly planned city in Britain, was built by men who had decided, on principle, not to plan too much. Then they actually had to build it. What happened over the next 25 years has almost no parallel in this country. On land that had grown wheat and grazed cattle, an entire city rose, piece by piece, grid square by grid square. Roads first, then drainage, then whole neighbourhoods of housing, then the shops and schools and offices to serve them. Junctions were built as roundabouts, on the theory that traffic should keep moving and never stop. Today there are more than 130 of them, and they have somehow become the single most mocked feature of the entire town. Alongside the roads for cars, the planners built a second, quieter network just for people. A web of paths for walking and cycling, kept separate from the traffic, winding through the green spaces between the grid squares. They called them redways, and today they run for more than 200 miles. And they planted trees. This is the part that gets forgotten under all the concrete jokes. From the very beginning, the idea was a forest city, and over the decades more than 20 million trees and shrubs went into the ground. The saplings of the 1970s were thin and awkward and did nothing to soften the raw new estates. Nobody who mocked the place in those early years was seeing the city that those trees would one day make. The housing went up grid square by grid square, and each square was meant to become its own small world, with its own character and sometimes its own architect. The corporation drew in celebrated designers to experiment, among them a young Norman Foster and the great Ralph Erskine, and the results ranged from the elegant to the strange to the frankly unloved. Between the built squares, the planners carved long ribbons of parkland along the valleys of the rivers Ouse and Ousel, and they dug shallow lakes to hold the floodwater and soften all the engineering. The main roads were given plain, functional labels, the horizontals and the verticals marked out like the lines on a map, so that a stranger could read the whole city like a grid reference. To its admirers, this was rational and calm and humane. To its critics, it was the coldest thing imaginable, a place that felt as though it had been solved rather than grown. At the centre of it all, they built a kind of cathedral to shopping. Begun in 1973 and opened in 1979, the shopping building was, at the time, the longest covered shopping street in the world. A vast, low, gleaming box of glass and steel. Its architects, Derek Walker, Stuart Mosscrop and Christopher Woodward, deliberately turned away from the windowless American mall that was spreading everywhere else. What they wanted was daylight. Long arcades flooded with sunshine, floored in marble, planted with real trees, far closer in spirit to a grand Victorian arcade, or the great glass halls of the previous century, than to anything in a suburban car park. From the outside it was a mirror, from the inside it was a greenhouse. When it opened in 1979, the ribbon was cut by the country's brand new Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Decades later, still young by the standards of protected buildings, it would be granted official listed status, recognised at last as a genuine work of architecture. And there was one more thing planted in Milton Keynes that mattered more than any single building. In 1969, an entirely new kind of university took root at a country house called Walton Hall on the edge of the site. It had no entry requirements and no campus full of students in the ordinary sense. It taught by post and by television, often late at night, to anyone at all who wanted to learn. The Open University. It had been dreamed up under Harold Wilson's government as a university of the air, a way to reach people who had been shut out of higher learning, and it settled on the edge of the new city almost as naturally as if the two ideas had been made for one another. It was the purest possible expression of the plan's founding promise, opportunity for anyone regardless of where they had started, and in the decades since, more than 2 million people have earned degrees through it. A city built on the idea of open futures had almost by accident become home to the most open institution in British education, and the people came. Slowly at first, then in a steady stream. Families leaving cramped flats in London for a new house with a garden and a car in the drive. By the standards of the ancient cities all around it, the place had no history at all. But it had space and work and something that felt to a certain kind of person like a genuine fresh start. They were young mostly, newlyweds and growing families and people who simply wanted more room than the tired old cities could give them. They arrived to find estates still ringed by mud and scaffolding, shops not yet open, saplings not yet grown, and neighbours who were all, like them, strangers starting over. For some of them it was lonely and unfinished, and nothing like the close community they had left behind. For others it was exactly the point, a chance to build a life somewhere that made no assumptions about who they were or where they had come from. And yet the strangest thing about Milton Keynes is not the roundabouts, or the cows, or the mirrored glass. It is what was already lying in the ground the planners built on, because only a few miles from the shining new shopping centre stood a shabby Victorian mansion where a generation earlier a small group of people had already built the very future the planners insisted could never be known. We will come back to that house, it changes everything. First, the laughter. Almost from the moment it was designated, Milton Keynes became a national joke, and the joke has never entirely stopped. To the rest of Britain, it was everything that felt wrong about the modern world. Too new, too flat, too American. A place with no pub on the corner and no crooked medieval street, just numbered roads and identical roundabouts and grass. The concrete cows, unveiled in 1978 by the town's artist in residence, became the perfect symbol for the mockers. Fake cows in a fake countryside in a fake town. Some have read the sculpture as a sly joke about exactly that, a herd of concrete animals for a place that had paved over the real ones. In time, the cows became a kind of national shorthand. Mention Milton Keynes anywhere in Britain and someone would bring them up, along with the roundabouts, as proof that the whole place was faintly ridiculous, artificial and characterless and vaguely embarrassing. The town spent its first decades as the punchline to a joke the rest of the country never seemed to tire of telling. There was, to be fair, something to the criticism. The bet on the private car was total, and for anyone without one, the spread-out, low-density city could feel isolating and hard to cross. Some of the grander dreams never arrived either. The planners had once imagined novel forms of public transport threading through the grid, experiments in buses that would come when you called for them, and in time those visions quietly faded, leaving a city that worked beautifully if you had a car and awkwardly if you did not. Even Weber's own admirers came to concede that it had become the town that many planners loved to hate. For a great many people arriving in those first years, the raw estates and the half-finished grid squares, before the trees had grown, felt less like a city than like a diagram of one, a place that had been reasoned into existence rather than lived into it. But the mockery was so complete that it hid a very simple fact. The thing was working, the population kept climbing, and the businesses kept coming. Whatever the rest of the country thought of it, people kept choosing to move there, and then there was the house. On the southern edge of the new city, in the old town of Bletchley that Milton Keynes had swallowed whole, stood a plain Victorian mansion in a scrap of parkland. During the Second World War, this had been the most secret place in Britain, Bletchley Park. It was here that thousands of code breakers, among them the mathematician Alan Turing, cracked the German Enigma cipher, work now widely credited with shortening the war by years and saving countless lives. Turing and a colleague named Gordon Welchman designed an electromechanical machine called the bomb to tear through the enemy's settings at a speed no human mind could match. And all of it was kept so secret that for decades afterwards, the men and women who had done the work were forbidden from breathing a word of it. The full story stayed buried until the 1970s, which means that as the first families of the new town were unpacking in their brand new homes just up the road, almost none of them had the faintest idea that the modern world had been invented within sight of their gardens. But Bletchley did something else, something that speaks directly to the strange philosophy of the city that later grew up around it. To break the most complex German codes, the engineers there built a machine. In 1943, a post office engineer named Tommy Flowers led the construction of Colossus, a room-sized machine of some 1,600 glowing valves, widely regarded as the world's first programmable electronic computer. Years before America's famous machines, in a wooden hut in Buckinghamshire, human beings had built the ancestor of every computer you have ever touched. Sit with the irony of that for a moment. Milton Keynes was built on the principle, borrowed from an American theorist, that the future was fundamentally unknowable, that no one could truly predict how people would live, and it was built directly on top of the one patch of England where decades earlier people had quietly invented the machine that would go on to make the future more predictable, more computable, more knowable than any planner in 1970 could possibly have dreamed. And the last twist is the one that should stop you cold. As the new city spread outward through the 1970s, the birthplace of the computer very nearly did not survive it. The Bletchley Park site was almost cleared, the huts and the mansions swept away to make room for a housing estate. The place where the modern world began was saved, not by the planners of the future city, but by a stubborn band of veterans and enthusiasts who simply refused to let it be bulldozed. The city of the unknowable future came within a whisker of paving over the very spot where the future had first been switched on. In 1992, its great work largely done, the Milton Keynes Development Corporation was quietly wound up. The experiment was closed. What it left behind was no longer an experiment at all. It was a city. Today, more than 250,000 people live in Milton Keynes, and by some measures it is still one of the fastest growing places in the entire country. Its economy is larger and more productive than that of many far older cities, generating billions of pounds a year and turning out more per worker than the national average. In 2022, as part of the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee, it was finally granted the status its founders had always intended. It became a city in name as well as in scale, and it has not stopped growing. Current projections expect its population to climb toward 400,000 within a generation. The place mocked from the outside as soulless has, tellingly, always been rather liked by the people who actually live inside it, who tend to point at the space and the greenery and the ease of getting around and wonder what exactly everyone else is laughing at. The trees that looked so thin and hopeless in the 1970s have grown into a canopy. The forest city is no longer a slogan on a plan. It is real, more than 20 million trees deep, so that scarcely any home sits far from green space, and the grid squares now rest in genuine woodland. The founders could only imagine. The shopping building is a protected monument. The Open University teaches the world. The grid, for all the jokes, still does exactly what it was built to do, moving people with a smoothness that older cities, choking on their beautiful medieval streets, can only envy. And the concrete cows are still there, battered, repainted, occasionally stolen, once beheaded, once dressed in pyjamas by persons unknown. The original sits safely in a museum now, with replicas out grazing in the parkland. They remain the most photographed residents of the town, the punchline that quietly outlived the joke. Think back to those cows in the grass, half the size of the real thing, made of scrap, standing in a field where, within living memory, actual cattle grazed on farmland that had never heard of a grid or a roundabout or 250,000 people. Everyone was invited to laugh at Milton Keynes, at its newness, its roads, its refusal to look anything like the old England of the postcard villages. But the men who built it were never trying to make a postcard. They had decided that the future could not be known, and so they refused to freeze their city into a single dream. They built a frame and left the rest open. And that humility, that willingness to admit they could not see what was coming, is exactly why it is still standing, still growing, still working, while grander and prouder visions have crumbled all around it. The utopias that tried to dictate the future mostly failed. The great modernist estates that knew precisely how people ought to live were dynamited within a single generation. The planned perfection of other schemes aged quietly into decay. Milton Keynes, which promised almost nothing except room to change, simply kept on adapting. Its grid absorbed the supermarket and the business park and the distribution shed and the data centre, none of which its founders could even have named, exactly as Melvin Webber had said it would. The frame held, the future poured in and filled it. Milton Keynes was the one city honest enough to admit that nobody could see what was coming, which is perhaps why, more than half a century later, it is still here, still becoming whatever comes next. If you found this story worth your time, YouTube also thinks you are going to like the one on your screen right now, so go ahead and click it. And if you would like more forgotten histories of the places we think we already understand, subscribe before you go.